You will find the castle at the end of the North Road. The Duke of Netherby told his bride of 1 hour, without once looking at her. It is cold, and it is half empty, and I do not expect to trouble it with my presence above once a year. My steward has the keys. Do with it what you like. It has been nothing to me for a long time. Gideon Marle, 9th Duke of Netherby, said this from the window of his London study, watching the rain, and he told himself he felt nothing at all, which was the great lie of his life and one he had grown very skilled at telling. He had married Honora Bell that morning because his dying father's will had required him to take a wife before Michaelmas or forfeit the northern estate to a cousin he despised, and Honora Bell, penniless, gently born, plain-spoken, had been the nearest respectable woman his lawyers could produce in the time allowed. He had done it as a man signs a paper. He did not intend to think of it again. I see, said Honora behind him. Her voice was steady. And you, your grace, where will you be? In town. Wherever I please. He turned then, because it was rude not to, and he looked at her properly for the first time, a slight woman in a travelling dress that had been turned twice, with a direct grey gaze that made him unaccountably wish to look away. I will be plain with you, madam, for I think you would rather I were. I did not marry you to make a wife of you. I married you to keep an estate from my cousin. You will have the castle and income, and your freedom. I will have the title clear. Neither of us need pretend it is more than that. No, Honora agreed. We need not pretend. He had expected tears, or reproach, or the wheedling grief of a woman who had hoped for more. He got none of it, and it disquieted him, though he could not have said why. She merely gathered her single trunk and thanked him with cool courtesy for the carriage, and went north to Netherby Castle alone, and Gideon returned to the window and the rain and told himself he was glad to be rid of the whole tiresome business. Netherby Castle, when Honora came to it, was as he had promised, cold and half empty, and nothing to anyone. 3/4 of its rooms were shut under Holland covers. Its gardens had gone to bramble. The few servants left were old and idle, and startled to see a mistress at all, for no duke had lived there in a decade and no duchess in living memory. The great hall was so cold their breath smoked in it at noon. Honora Bell looked at all of this, the ruin, the cold, the abandonment, the plain fact that her husband had given her a dead house and ridden away, and she did not weep either. She rolled up her sleeves instead. Gideon knew none of this. He returned to his London life, to his clubs and his silences and the careful management of a heart he had walled up so long ago he had half forgotten there was anything behind the wall. He had built that wall as a boy, brick by brick, in a house where love had been a thing that arrived and then died, a mother buried before he was 6, a father who had turned to stone in his grief and taught his son to do the same. Gideon had learned that to love was to be left, and so he had resolved with the cold logic of a wounded child never to love at all. It had made him powerful. It had made him feared. It had made him, though he would not have used the word, unspeakably lonely, in a way he had ceased even to notice, the way a man ceases to notice a sound that never stops. The letters began in October. He did not answer the first. It was brief and businesslike, and reported that the Duchess had reopened the East Wing and engaged 2 additional maids and a cook, and that the tenants had been sent coal for the winter. He read it and set it aside and thought her industrious, and forgot it. The second, in November, mentioned that the orchard had been pruned and would fruit again in the spring, and that the old gardener, Tam, had wept to see it, having planted it as a boy. There was a line at the end, the great hall no longer smokes. We have mended the flue. It is warm now. He read that line twice, and did not know why, and set the letter aside. By January the letters were no longer businesslike. She wrote of the village school she had opened in the gatehouse, and of a shepherd's family she had taken in through the worst of the snow, and of the way the whole castle now smelled of baking bread on a Tuesday. She wrote that she had found, in a locked chest in the shut nursery, a child's sampler worked with the letters G and M, and had it framed and hung above the hall fire, thinking he might know it was there, and might one day be glad of it. She wrote of small ordinary warmths. Cat that had adopted the kitchen, a tenant's family mended, the sound of children's voices in a house that had heard none in a lifetime, and she wrote them plainly, without reproach, without any request that he come, as though she were simply telling a distant friend how his old home had come back to life. Gideon began to answer. He told himself at first that it was only proper stewardship, that a duke ought to know what became of his estate, but his replies grew longer than stewardship required. He found himself at his club, thinking not of the card table before him, but of an orchard he had not seen in a decade, and of a woman's steady grey gaze, and of a warm hall where his mother's sampler now hung above a fire he had never once thought to light. In the spring he did a thing he had not planned and could not explain. He ordered his horse north. There was one letter he did not answer for a long time, because he did not know how. It came in February, on the coldest week of the year, and it was shorter than the others. She wrote that she had found in the shut and shrouded rooms of the West Tower, the old nursery, his nursery, untouched since his mother's death, a rocking horse under a dust sheet, a shelf of small books, a little coat, moth-worn, hung on a peg where a child had left it 30 years before. She wrote, "I have not disturbed it, save to light a fire and let the damp out of the walls, for I think a room where a child was once loved should not be left to rot in the cold, whatever came after. If it grieves you that I opened it, tell me and I will shut it again. But I think it was a happy room once, Gideon, and I did not like to leave it sad." Gideon read that letter in his club among the noise and the smoke, and had to rise and walk out into the street to be alone with it. He had not thought of that nursery in 20 years. He had spent 20 years not thinking of it, of the mother who had rocked him there, of the fire that had burned there, while she lived and gone out forever when she died, of the small frightened boy he had been, who had learned in that very room that the warmest things in the world are the ones most surely taken away. He had shut the door on it, literally and in his heart, and had built his whole cold life upon keeping it shut. And a woman he had married in an afternoon and never troubled to know had walked into that room alone, in the dead of winter, and had not seen a thing to be feared or forgotten, had seen only a room where a child was once loved, and had lit a fire in it, and asked his leave, gently, to let it be warm again. He wrote back that night, and it was the first letter he had ever written her that was not about the estate. He wrote, "Do not shut it. Light the fire. It was a happy room. I had forgotten that it was allowed to be." And then he sat a long while with the pen in his hand, wanting to write more, wanting to write things he had no words for, about a warm room and a cold heart and a woman who could tell the difference between a thing that was ruined and a thing that was only waiting to be loved again. But he did not have the words, he had never been given them, so he sent the one line and told himself it was enough, and knew that it was not, and did not understand yet that what had begun in him would not let him rest until he had ridden north to say the rest with his own voice. In the warm room she had opened, that he had been too afraid to enter for 20 years. He told his steward it was to inspect the accounts. He told himself the same. He believed neither. He came up the north road at evening and reined in where the trees broke, because he did not recognize the place. The castle he had abandoned had been a black and shuttered ruin, a thing he had been glad to be rid of. What stood before him now glowed. Every window of the east wing was lit gold against the dusk. Smoke rose warm and steady from a dozen chimneys that had stood cold for years. The gardens were dug and ordered and greening. From the open door of the great hall came firelight, and the smell of bread, impossibly in a house that had heard nothing but silence for a lifetime, the sound of laughter. Gideon sat his horse in the shadow of the trees for a long time, and did not go in. He watched the door instead. And presently Honora came out of it, a shawl about her shoulders and a lantern in her hand, to see the last of the light off the hills, his wife, whom he had given a dead house and left. She had a smudge of flour on her wrist. She was laughing at something a child within had said. And the firelight was behind her, and the last of the sun was on her face, and Gideon Marl, 9th Duke of Netherby, who had walled up his heart at 6 years old and had thought the wall would hold forever, felt it come down all at once, without warning. The way a dam that has held too long against too great a pressure does not crumble but simply breaks. He dismounted. He crossed the drive on foot, and she heard the gravel and turned and lifted the lantern and saw who it was. "Your Grace," she said. Surprise, but no fear and no reproach, never any reproach from her. "You have come." "I did not." Gideon stopped. He had rehearsed nothing, and he found he could not lie to her, standing in the light she had made. "I told my steward it was the accounts, it was not the accounts." Honora waited. "I gave you a tomb," he said. His voice was not steady now. Nothing in him was steady. I gave you a cold, dead, half-ruined house and a husband who rode away without looking at you, and I told you it was nothing to me, and I believed it. And you? He looked past her at the glowing windows, at the smoke, at the light. You made it live. You made it warm. You hung my mother's sampler above a fire I never had the courage to light. Every letter you sent me, I told myself I was reading it for the estate. I was not reading it for the estate. I was reading it because of the only warm thing that had reached me in 20 years, and I did not know it until this moment, standing here, unable to make myself go in, because I gave you nothing, madam, nothing at all, and you turned it into a home. He could not finish. He, who was never at a loss, who had commanded rooms into silence with a word, stood before his own door and could not finish the sentence. Honora set the lantern down on the step. She came to him across the gravel, and she looked up at him with that steady grey gaze that had made him wish to look away on their wedding day, and now made him unable to look at anything else. You gave me one thing, she said gently. You gave me the freedom to make of it whatever I could. Most men would not have. Most men would have kept me in London to be neglected in comfort. You gave me a door and rode away and left me the whole of it to fill. She reached up and very lightly laid her flour-smudged hand against the side of his face, the first time anyone had touched him so in longer than he could remember. I did not fill it to reproach you, Gideon. I filled it because it was cold, and I could not bear a cold thing. And I think, her voice softened, I think you have been a cold thing for a very long time, and no one ever thought to warm you either. He turned his face into her hand. He, the Duke of Netherby, before whom lords bowed and lawyers trembled, stood in his own drive with his eyes shut and his wife's flour-dusted palm against his cheek, and he did not trust himself to speak, because he had spent a lifetime learning that to love was to be left, and here was proof. Standing in the light of a house she had raised from the dead, that he had been wrong, that love was also this, a warm door opened by a woman who had every right to hate him and had chosen instead to save his home. Will you come in? Honora asked. The bread is nearly done. And there is a chair by the fire that no one has ever sat in. I think it was always meant to be yours. Yes, Gideon managed, yes. If you will have me in it. I married you, she said, with the ghost of a smile. I have been having you all along. You simply were not here to notice. He laughed. A rusty, unfamiliar sound, torn out of a man who had not laughed in years, and he took her hand from his face and held it, flower and all, and let her lead him up the steps and through the door of the home he had abandoned and she had built, into the firelight and the warmth and the smell of bread, and the child's voice within calling out to know who had come. He never left again. He did not go back to London that spring, nor the next, nor any spring after. The clubs and the silences and the walled-up heart he left behind him on the North Road, and he did not miss them. He learned the tenants' names as she had. He sat in the chair by the fire that had always been meant for him. He hung beside his mother's sampler, a new one his wife worked over that first long winter, its letters G and H, and when visitors asked he told them, without shame, that his wife had taught him what a house was for, and on cold evenings, when the wind came down off the northern hills and rattled the old glass, the Duke of Netherby would sit in his warm hall with Honora's head against his shoulder and the fire snapping in the grate, and he would think of the young fool he had been, who gave away a castle and called it nothing, and who had ridden north one spring to inspect the accounts, and had found, instead, the whole of his life, lit gold, waiting at the end of the road for a man too frightened to come home.